As you know, the euro area is passing through a very difficult time. There have been huge upsets in the financial markets. Bond and equity markets in particular have been highly volatile, and there's a degree of uncertainty which prevails the whole system. It can be said that most member states have largely recognized the gravity of the situation and have already implemented or are in the process of implementing various major reforms. These are generally directed at fiscal consolidation and the enhancement of competitiveness and growth, and include significant labour market reforms, as in Spain, and reform of the public administration, as in Italy. Ireland and Portugal are on track in the implementation of their EU IMF programmes. But the tensions in the debt markets are clearly not over yet. Despite the efforts being made by policymakers across the European Union, the sovereign debt crisis continues and its ramifications are still uncertain. The recent rise in Spanish yields and the turbulence in Greece are evidence of this. The main problem is that fiscal consolidation has to be effected at a time of an economic downturn. Recessionary conditions slow down GDP growth and compound the difficulties that are encountered in the reduction of the fiscal deficit and debt. In this presentation, I will cover various dimensions of the sovereign debt problem and conclude with some observations that are of particular relevance to Malta. Okay, so basically there has been quite what is called sometimes a repricing of risk by the markets, and financial institutions have tended to unwind their holdings of public and private sector debt. This, in fact, can be seen in the first chart, which shows the leverage ratio, or basically the assets to equity ratio. And as you can see, the blue one, which is the European line, has declined from around 18 to around 14.94, showing quite an extensive deleverage effect. In the case of Malta, the change has been much less, much more stable, and of course I will come back to this issue later. Let me just stick with that for now. So basically the situation has resulted in a lot of financial institutions reducing their lending activity. I think it is fair to say that over the past perhaps 10 to 15 years, there was what some people called a new paradigm, which ended up not being a new paradigm at all. There was extensive expansion of debt, both by sovereigns and in the private sector, huge creativity in coming out with new instruments, but unfortunately the regulatory aspect of these lagged behind significantly and resulted in a lot of lack of transparency, which is one of the previous speaker emphasized this. In effect, a lot of these new concoctions that appeared were intended to reduce the risk, spread it, but they were not very transparent. And this resulted in spreading even greater risk to a lot of people, and nobody knew exactly what they had. So this is part of the problem. The European Central Bank has sought to avert a credit crunch and the bank funding crisis via a number of measures, including the 2-3-year long-term refinancing operations, the so-called LTROs, launched last December and February. These have been provided on what is called a full allotment basis and at the average marginal refinancing operations rate over the 3-year term. So whatever the rate is over the 3-year is the rate that they will attract. These operations have helped to stabilize bank lending to the private sector, as well as the bank's holdings of government securities. However, the effectiveness of these operations has been reduced, as banks have preferred to place a substantial part of their additional funds with the ECB. As the next chart shows, the blue line are the longer-term refinancing operations, and you can see how they went up significantly towards the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, which provided banks with liquidity. But in effect, what has happened is that if you look at the red line, which shows the so-called deposit facility, this refers to the amount of funds that banks deposit with the ECB. You can see that what has happened is that banks started depositing huge amounts too with the ECB. Now, these were not the same institutions that took out the funds from the ECB based on the collateral that they provided. Of course, the system, at the end of the day, circulated these funds, and they ended up with other institutions that preferred to put them with the ECB and rather than risk lending them to other banks. In fact, one of the biggest changes that has occurred is that the interbank market has practically gone to sleep. There is hardly any interest amongst the various banks to do the normal process, which is to recirculate funds amongst themselves. So what's happening is the ECB has had to take this role. It is acting as a kind of an anchor, as a center piece of the institutional network, where banks are getting funds from the ECB based on the collateral they have, and then other banks are depositing these funds with the ECB. So this is, as you can see, wasn't the case in the mid-2006, 2007, but became a phenomenon of this uncertainty. Of course, this doesn't come free, unfortunately, because banks are borrowing at the current marginal rate, which is 1%, and when they deposit at 0.25%. So in effect, this whole operation, which is being done voluntarily by the banks, they prefer basically, the system is preferring to pay a cost for a certain certainty about the funds that they can withdraw on in case they need to. So these are very unusual times. I will skip over the next graph, which shows the same thing basically, but using monetary aggregates, and the money supply and base money and so on. So in the interest of trying to rush a bit through this presentation, I will go to the next part. The creation of the euro basically reduced the cost of borrowing. And this for a number of reasons. First, the way investors regarded the euro was that any debt in the euro had a similar risk profile. Probably this was a mistake, because the treaty does indeed state that the debt of one country has no implications on the debt of other countries. Probably, too, that this euphoria in creating the euro resulted in this kind of perhaps lack of focus. So the other thing which reduced the costs, of course, is the elimination of exchange rates. This led to lower costs. And in essence, the borrowing costs, also because in the US there was a tendency to lower the costs of borrowing as well. So essentially, the world went into a period of unusually low borrowing costs. And this created a lot of imbalances in the system. So you had bubbles coming up, housing bubbles, other asset bubbles. Bubbles at some point tend to be overblown, tend to burst, and then you get a fallout and you get the various crises that we experienced over a number of years now. In some member states of the European Union, there were also some institutional characteristics that played a major role. Seeking to explain the sources of the Greek crisis, my former Greek colleague at the European Court of Auditors, Mr. Salmas, has pointed out, and there's a reference in my paper, has pointed out to the lack of a culture of effectiveness that holds the Greek government accountable for its policies.